You may have just turned on the news and be shocked by the fact that a Twitter account, NEXTA, became a terrorist organization in Belarus. Well, it's actually not a new thing. As I was preparing the episode on how Russia used the list of extremist and terrorist organizations in the fight against its own enemies, inside and outside the country, it cancelled the license for two more international organizations, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. So the motto of this episode should be, who's gonna be next? And how long will people buy into this narrative that a totalitarian government creates to speak a democratic language to fight against democracy? There are two important features to understand about Russian war machine to deconstruct how ideological language works. First, there is no polarization anymore, but hybridity. The idea is that you don't have to say that one part of the world is dark and the other one is light. You have to claim that things are complex, mixed. We live in the world of post-truth, fakes, and impossibility to establish the fact. This is why the list of extremist and terrorist organizations in Russia, as well as in Belarus, as a vassal state, include Nazi parties, but also Muslim and just democratic media. Feature number 2. The language does not require to have its specific terms, like Bolshevism, communism, socialism. A historian, Mikhail Maltsev, writes that it's a really banal idea by now in Russian studies, that the state machine no longer requires any ism, like Marxism or Leninism. This can be understood as mimicry. It's easier for the Russian state machine just to say that you are a Nazi, you are an exploitator, you are the killer. What about what you did? It doesn't have to prove anything, but to remain in a floating position of not having any stance. So let's continue thinking about these two features, hybridity and absence of any ideology. The Russian special forces rely on the list of extremist and terrorist organizations created by the Ministry of Jurisdiction of Russia. This list is published in the Russian newspaper. This list defines several neo-Nazi, Muslim, religious, and even democratic organizations as terrorist. It's not a mystery why, but we need to look into this carefully. Chapter 1. Muslim organizations. The first shot in 2006 was Jun Am Sham. It's a guerrilla organization that fights against Israel and it's considered to be a terrorist in different parts of the world. This was one of the first organizations to be banned by the list, and it justifies its use for the state officials of certain countries, like the US. Paradoxically, officially, Russia is the only place that made this organization into a terrorist one. Then in 2008, we see a particular shift against the organizations that could have supported the independence of Tatarstan. It's known that in 1989-1990, the Republic of Tatarstan sought independence. Then there were peaceful movements for the separation of Tatarstan from the territory of Russia. And preventively, the Russian state tried to get rid of possible pro-Turkish, pro-Muslim sentiment inside the country. Muslims were a really useful victim, especially after 9/11, for creating an image of an enemy inside the country, since the Chechens, the victims of Russian genocide, were also Muslims. Also, Muslim population is the second biggest in Russia. So suppressing it beforehand is the part of the colonial policy to preserve the Ruski-centered state. In terms of a preventive strike, there were several organizations that were banned in 2008. First, the international religious organization Nurjuar. According to some specialists of the Institute of the Middle East, with the president whose name is Satanovsky. It's ridiculous, but the board of the organization included an expert who does not exist in the reality, M.N. Davidov. They claim that the teachings of Said Nursi underlie the Nursular ideology, which operates in Turkey and a number of countries around the world. These scholars noted that in the regions of Russia and Muslim-dominated countries, Nursular supporters allegedly spread the idea of pan-Turkism and pan-Islamism, which can provoke, I quote, conflicts between representatives of different nationalities and confessions. There were some brave Muslims to speak against that. According to the director of the Russian Islamic University, R. Muhammadson, nowhere in the works of Nursi is there a single mention of either pan-Turkism or pan-Islamism. It is known that Nursi was an opponent of any nationalism and racism, the rector openly stated. With Nurjular, there was a shift in the discourse in which international religious organizations were described. Now they became religious unions, объединения, meaning that they don't have this supreme status of being organized by an idea. 2017 is the year when we see how this hybrid discourse is applied to particularly Tatarstan and the Tatars trying to seek their religious individuality. So the organization called All Tatar Social Center, among other organizations that were fought, was a Muslim organization of the Crimean Tatars who resisted the Russian occupation. And so all of them, including the leader Mustafa Dzhemilev, were banned in 2016. Chapter 2. Nazi Organizations. The list of Nazi organizations that exist in Russia and were put on the list is huge. I would mention a few. In 2011 was the movement against illegal immigration that targeted Muslims. In 2015 it was a local organization in a small city, Tula, called Tula Skins, which had lots of references to punk rock and more international movements against any diversity. It was called Misanthropic Division. Also, 2015 was the year when the military patriotic club, the White Cross, was banned, and so forth. This list is really long, and paradoxically, although these organizations are banned, they continue to exist. They just cannot participate in elections. And besides that, they justify the list of extremist and terrorist organizations as legit in terms of banning religious and democratic institutions. This list would not work conceptually if it included only Muslims. So it started to get filled with Nazi parties. Some of these parties became the part of the mainstream, like Rogozin, who governs now Roscosmos, Russian space program. But the political parties that supported the Russian invasion in Crimea, like National Bolshevik Party, were banned. Its affiliate Dugin was the one to support Iran in 2005, and probably it's an internal conflict that happened inside the elites in Russia that made them struggle against National Bolsheviks. Also, National Bolsheviks is the image that we see today in the invasion of Ukraine. The combination of the ideas of Bolshevism and Nazism, racism and unification, the domination of one group of the other, but the group has no particular features. It's what Maria Zakharova, the spokeswoman of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Russia, said on April the 8th. Borscht can be a good example of how Nazi Bolshevism is opposed to any other democratic discourse. Nazi Bolshevism, it's like borscht. It's the symbol that Bolsheviks would like to appropriate. It's red, it's eaten everywhere in Russia and also in other countries. So why should it be Ukrainian? Why shouldn't it be just everybody's borscht? Then she claims that it's very chauvinistic for Russians to call borscht Ukrainian. And it doesn't matter what its history and reality. It doesn't even matter that the Russians call borscht Ukrainian. Nobody forced them to do it, and borscht exists in other Slavic cultures as well. It's like a Pole would complain about dumplings called Ukrainian because historically dumplings with potatoes are considered to come from Ukraine. Obviously, we're not talking about food. For Zakharova, borscht is a symbol of something that can be appropriated by a stronger group. The culture of reappropriation is already criticized by the African Americans in the USA, but for Russians, it's a new thing. They don't read post-colonial theories about reappropriation, and they believe that they're inventors of reappropriation that can be used for their own benefit. When I speak about this in English, for me it's obvious how it works. It's the way of mimicking, saying that, oh, it belongs to everybody, so it does not belong to the people who invented it. Chapter 3. The list weaponized in the war against Ukraine. During the first Russian-Ukrainian war in 2014, the Ukrainian organization Right Sector was banned. The organization Ukrainian National Assembly, UNAUNSO, with the history of fighting Russian secret services, was banned as well. And a historical entity that does not exist at the moment, the Ukrainian insurgent army, was also banned, just in case it reinvents itself and becomes real. By the way, the leader of pro-Russian Chechens movement still believes that that Stefan Bandera, the leader of the Ukrainian insurgent army, is still alive. Chapter 4. The list being weaponized in the fight against political competitors. The first party, art preparation, art подготовка, was banned very professionally. There were provocations in the press, and the leader, Maltsev, was basically turned into a terrorist, anti-Semite, who was talking about conspiracy theories, and also his licking of the Kremlin's butt was turned against him. For instance, he claims that Vladimir Kara-Murza, an opposition leader, was poisoned not because of the political reasons, but just for love affairs. The same argument was used against other political opponents of Putin.
Like Boris Nemtsov, who was killed 100 meters from the Kremlin for his criticism of the invasion of Ukraine during the First War.
The truth is that Maltsev was continuously repeating one idea on his YouTube channel, which was really popular.
That the narrative that takes responsibility from Putin for economic failures, blaming ministers but not him,
Tsar, that was a historical fabrication.
Maltsev addressed this narrative harshly.
He said, I quote, "If Tsar doesn't know what's happening in his country, then he has to be put in a madman house. If he knows and he doesn't stop it, then he has to be jailed. And if he knows and helps corruption, then he has to be killed." This was very terroristic from the position of the Kremlin. Two other examples of democratic terrorist organization are easy to deconstruct. The political party of Navalny was banned in 2021, as well as Navalny was supposed to die out of poisoning by the Secret Service poison Novichok. On April the 8th, 2022, NEXTA, the grassroots medium that pissed off the dictator Lukashenko in Belarus. You know this medium because of Roman Protasevich, who was detained by landing a Ryanair flight that just passed the Belarus airspace. So by now, by listening to Chapter 1 on Muslims, Chapter 2 on the Ukrainians, Chapter 3 on the political dissidents, you may ask, okay, everything is post-truth, we cannot be sure that they're not terrorist organizations, and they're described exactly in the language as a liberal society would describe them, as extremists, as people looking for supremacy of a particular ideology over the other one. But there is one fact that opens Chapter 5. The organizations that oppose military service. A separate chapter. The international organization that exists in every country and has no problem with the governments, even in Iraq or Afghanistan. These are the Jehovah Witnesses. They started to be banned since 2009, first in Taganrog and other smaller cities like Samara in 2014, Abinsk in 2015, Stary Oskol in 2016, Belgorod also in 2016, until it was completely banned in 2017. What is the problem with this organization? And if you ask, how is it possible that religious organizations suddenly become terrorist ones? You may want to think of how the state propaganda works. It requires total belief, which is based on values. And if an organization like the Jehovah Witnesses argues that the person should avoid military service, it then must be terminated, because it creates turbulence in the state. Also, I guess that the Russian government doesn't like that they are witnesses. There should be no witnesses to state crimes against its own people. Knowingly, any grassroots organizations threaten the existence of a totalitarian government for one reason. They speak a different language. They avoid supporting patriotism based on the Kremlin's agenda. And sometimes they're even looking for the presence in the parliament. So simply to conclude and to return to the things that I was mentioning in the intro of this video. Russian state machine is not inventing new terms. It's not trying to create its own language to map difference. It wants actually people outside of the country believe that it's fighting not with dissidents, but with evil. And to look through this is not hard. It's enough to compare, but at the same time, it's harder because 80% of the list can be seen as a list of terrorist and extremist organizations, while the list itself is created to ban the other 20. So if you find this information helpful, please subscribe. I also will appreciate your comments. Thank you for listening.